This tournament is going to be incredible. Firstly, in terms of competition, I've had a look at the participants list. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. Secondly, in terms of topics, discussions, some maybe fruitful debates, these are some of my favorite motions I've ever set with a CAP that I'm so happy to have worked with. All right, so with this briefing, we're just going to give you some overview of some debating rules and some general important information for the tournament. I will have to leave at some point to go to another meeting, so I'm going to be quite quick, but all of this will be shared with all participants so that you can go over this at any time during the tournament. And of course, every CAP member should be available for you guys to ask and answer questions during the duration of the tournament. Okay, so some basics of British parliamentary debating. You'll have 15 minutes to prepare. Each speaker is giving a 7-minute speech. You'll have protected time during the first and 6 minute with no POIs allowed during this time. And of course, no internet usage is allowed. Obviously, we are debating online, but we expect you not to be Googling, not to be using ChatGPTs to take your speech, etc. All right. Obviously, you can type your notes at an online competition. That is okay. All right, in terms of the basics of British parliamentary, we have 4 teams. 2 of them are proposing the motion, 2 are opposing the motion, with opening government proposing it as the first team, their first speaker being the Prime Minister. After that, the Leader of Opposition for the opening opposition presents, and a Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Leader of Opposition, government member, opposition member, government whip, and opposition whip. The reason we go through these things at every single tournament in every single briefing is because I've had some absolutely shocking examples of people who were just taught or coached the wrong things, and then they come and they demand that those are the rules or the way that we should be debating. And so it's important at every single tournament that this is standardized, okay? So, some ideas of what you can do as a team. Obviously, whatever you do that convinces the judge is up to you. I'm very much a if you did something and you won, do that again type of coach. But if you didn't do that, I'm going to ask, well, why? If you didn't win, I'm going to ask, well, why didn't you, as opening government, define the motion and the debates in general, set up strategic framing so that everybody understands the debate moving forward, make arguments in favor of the motion and rebut the opening opposition. Opening opposition, if you didn't win, why didn't you make arguments against the motion, rebut opening government and redefine the motion, only if absolutely necessary? In closing government, did you extend the government's case in a distinct but consistent manner to opening governments? And did you create new substantive materials, refutations, framing, examples, characteristics, and metrics? And in closing opposition, did you extend the opening opposition's case in a way that's consistent and distinct, and create refutations to the government bench, new distinctive refutations, as well as framing, examples, characterization, metrics, etc.? Okay, I'm sure your first question was, oh, you just said only if absolutely necessary should I challenge the definition. When is it absolutely necessary? So generally, you should be defining debates that are in the spirit of the debate, not in the semantic, technical, this could be the way it's defined debate, okay? This means that we're not trying to have exact wording, keeping in line with dictionary definitions at every single moment, but rather we're trying to have valuable discussions, okay? So as an adjudicator, we're asking ourselves, is the way that the debate defined this motion, or one specific team defined this motion, reasonable and adequate? From the opening government, if they've defined the way in the debate in a way that is reasonable, you would assume a reasonable person who's thinking with their brain, that's the way that they would define the motion, then you move forward with that definition unless there is an incredibly substantial clash and challenge. However, I doubt that there would be. So if it is reasonable, you would go through with it. That is the burden of opening government in terms of defining that, okay? If it is unreasonable, then we'd still expect teams to point out that it's unreasonable so that we can credit that towards teams. But as adjudicators, we can then say this was an unreasonable way to define it in the first place. So you've overburdened other teams if they are taking on that burden to debate under that motion. Okay. So, for example, if the motion was this House would ban smoking, we would assume that you would pass legislation to ban the sale, purchase, and consumption of cigarettes. Okay. And that anybody caught in engaging in these activities would be criminally liable. Squirreling, however, would be when you define a debate that is literally inconsistent with the words of the actual motion or is an undebatable definition. For example, you might say, we will only ban smoking for anyone under 18. It's clearly not what the motion is saying. It's a general ban on smoking. And so that you are trying to make it more favorable to your side. But firstly, your opposition cannot predict that. Secondly, you're actually making a half concession. You're basically saying that, like, oh, I don't actually believe I can debate the motion, so I'm going to try and change the motion to make it more debatable. And that means that you're admitting out loud that you couldn't win under the actual motion, all right? So teams can challenge squirrel definitions, and judges must weigh the contributions team made to the debate based on the accepted definition at the time that they gave their speeches. Any other rules that are important to note in terms of knifing? Closing teams are required to be consistent with their opening teams, except in rare circumstances, like if there's clearly false factual claims, if there is an active squirreling of the motion, etc. And it is okay for closing teams to disagree about what is important in the debate, but not take away or rebut the claims that the opening government has made. All right. If you're the closing government, the opening opposition has made. If you're the closing opposition, again, this is something that is important. Everybody should be noting this because I am consistently finding teams who are telling me exactly why their opening is wrong, as if they are rebutting them across the bench. So please be mindful of your knifing, right? Then secondly, in terms of new material, whip speakers should not provide new material in their speeches, for example, new argumentation, definitions, etc. But however, new weighings, impacts, framings, and responses are allowed. So, the way you should be defining this, again, you're probably, if you're debating quite consistently well, you're probably not the problem. I think people get a bit over scared about these rules in terms of new material in whips, and they basically just say, oh, I'm not allowed to say literally any word that hasn't been said before. The way you should be thinking about this is, are you starting a new conversation or a new direction for the debate, or are you contributing to things that have already happened within the debate? Okay, so if you're contributing to clashes that you can identify and tell me which teams brought up these clashes and what arguments they used to substantiate these clashes, then after you've shown me that that clash exists in the debates from other speakers, not from you as a whip speaker, if you then give new refutations to that clash, a new example that helps me understand the government bench's point of view of that clash, a new way to frame or consider that material, something like they talk a lot about agency, but what agency really is X, Y, and Z, then you are contributing to a clash that already exists that is allowed. However, if you suddenly bring up a psychology point or a philosophical perspective that doesn't link to anything anybody else has said before, that is considered new material. Even if you believe it brings value to your bench or value to your case, then that would not be allowed. And basically, the rule is adjudicators will just not write that down. They will not weigh that in their consideration. It's as if you didn't speak for that time. Okay, quickly on motion types. I feel like I've said this 100 times this year, but what is the purpose of motion types in debating competitions? When we set motions, we are very specific about the wordings and the motion types that we use, right? So we can say something along the lines of, there's a difference in the debate at if it was this house as potential parents would choose to adopt rather than have biological children, or if it was this house believes that potential parents should adopt rather than have biological children. It doesn't sound like a big difference in the grand scheme of the English language, but in terms of the motion type, it does. One is an actor motion from the perspective of potential parents, which would be the first wording I said out loud. The other one is a neutral value-based motion from the perspective of society in general. And why do we make these types of motions? Is it so that you can never debate if it's a neutral society value-based motion? Does that mean you can never give any argumentation from the perspective of the potential parents? No, it doesn't. In fact, I will say right now, you can argue whatever you want under any motion. However, the consideration that we're going to make is, was that the most valuable based on the wording of the motion case to make? If it was your third or fourth argument and you're just bringing it in and you've prioritized the value-based arguments that are neutral from the perspective of society, you're probably doing a great job. You're matzah bombing. Love that for you, okay? But if you are only prioritizing what the motion wording has not inspired you to prioritize, you're probably just not the most strategic team in the room, and that's okay. We all deserve a fourth sometimes, okay? So when I'm setting a this house would motion, I am considering that the policy, the how consideration, the implementation discussion is what is the most important in that debate. It doesn't mean you can't run principle value-based discussions, but you should prioritize the implementation discussion. Why am I telling you to do that? I'm guiding you towards what we've already weighed as the most fair debate, and you should take that on yourself as well. If it is that this house believes that motion, for example, this house believes that there's no moral obligation to follow the law. This is the evaluation of the truth or the value of a statement. Okay, this means that we're just discussing, like, do you like this or not? Do you think that this is the way society ought to be or ought not to be? Okay, is there a moral obligation to follow the law or not? Generally, okay. So opening government has no fiat to propose a model in terms of enforcing this, but they still have to define the terms of the debate. If it's this house supports, this house opposes, this house supports the Belt and Road Initiative. We're evaluating whether something is good or bad, most likely a manifestation of how this would occur in the real world. If it is this house regrets, it's from a retrospective model. That means that you'd be still regretting as if you are opposing it, you don't like it. However, you're asking yourself, like, we don't regret something immediately or in an instance. We regret something because of like the impact of it over time. And so you would be looking at the impact of this over time by creating a retrospective model and talking about how this has created a rise in society or come up or proliferated within society. Okay, if it's this house prefers X. This house prefers a world without oatmeal raisin cookies. Fantastic debates. I hope that's one of the motions this tournament. Then you are comparing X to the status quo because there is no enforced evaluative alternative. All right. However, if it is this house prefers X to Y, this house prefers oatmeal raisin cookies to chocolate chip cookies, then Y is the counterfactual you have to compare to. I love these types of motions because this gives you more things to debate about, because then every government team is telling me reasons why oatmeal raisin cookies are amazing and reasons why chocolate chip cookies are not amazing. Opposition is telling me reasons why oatmeal raisin cookies are not amazing and why chocolate chip cookies are amazing. Okay. Same if you are identifying what the status quo is and you just describe it for me, and then in a reasonable way that's not squirreling the debates, and then you would still be able to double up that argumentation. New motion types, according to the Sophia WUDC manual, right? This house predicts X. This house predicts that Trump will win the 2024 US presidential elections. This was LSE's, the London School of Economics IV motion. I debated in this. It was fun. Basically, then you are using prediction models and using prediction tools in order to argue that this is likely to happen. That is the main burden of this. You will prove that it will happen or not happen. You have no burden to then prove if it is a good or bad thing, whether it does happen or not. So you are arguing whether you have enough evidence to assume that this would happen, or you do not have enough evidence, or it is flawed evidence, or there is counter evidence to say that this will not happen. Okay, this house hopes that X, for example, this house hopes that extraterrestrial life exists, is the Euros 2022 open final motion. You guys can go and watch it on YouTube. This is where you would need to evaluate two worlds, one where it will happen, one where it will not, and explain why X is preferable, not preferable to the counterfactual world. Teams should come up with a consensus on a timeline on when that necessarily happens. So you'd be debating that in the debate as well. Other changes that are important from the Sophia manual, okay? Because this does evolve and change the way we debate, okay? Backloading definitional challenges is no longer allowed, all right? If opening opposition wants to challenge the prime minister's definition, it must be done at the leader of opposition. If the leader of opposition neglects to challenge the definition, it is still permissible to the member of opposition to challenge the definition, ideally via a point of information. Secondly, models and counterprops use different kinds of resources, public will expenditure. Counterprops must use not only the same or fewer resources as net on opening government, but as but the same or less of each type of resource. And counterprops must also be related to the same broad policy goal or areas as the opening government model, or else it is not a successful counterprop, which I think that this was common sense. A lot of people were debating their counterprops like this to begin with, but it's just been now codified in the manual. Then also in section 2.11, closing teams are no longer under the obligation to be consistent with an opening team that has made a concession with the sole purpose of strategically narrowing the closing team's available arguments. This does not mean that all knives are now acceptable. This means that if opening government is squirreling the debates in a way that narrows the debate so that it's difficult to have a back half, like an opening government team actively coming up and saying, you cannot talk about any principles in this motion because of X, Y, and Z. This is only a practical motion. That is a concession being made in order to try and remove the back half from this debate. You, as a closing government team, can now say to the opening government team, no, we're going to run principles. That's fine, because they're trying to harm you. You don't need to be consistent with them just to avoid knifing. That's just been codified further, right? And in the event of a split decision, chairs are now explicitly required to call a vote on every pairwise comparison. Also, what we were practicing before has just been more codified. Okay, let's talk about judging quickly, all right? So with judges, what do we expect you to do as judges? And this is what it's important that speakers, you also hear this and you listen to this, because this is going to help me get valuable feedback from you on whether your judges are actually doing these things. Firstly, you should be consistently taking notes, a lot of notes, so many notes. You should be able to say the speeches back to the speakers. No, I'm kidding. That's obviously an overburden on the judges. But the point is, you should be having consistently in-depth notes on the debate. Okay, you should write down what speakers are actually saying, plus any feedback. You should be keeping order in the debate, especially if you are a chair. However, if your chair is struggling for any reason, panels, please also assist the chair by facilitating introductions, enforcing the rules of debate, timing speeches, and dealing with any technical issues that you find during the tournament. And then lastly, you should be tracking who's winning. Assess as the debate unfolds by examining the robustness of analysis that teams are bringing in, the importance of arguments that teams are bringing in, and the level of engagement that teams are bringing in, okay? How do you be a holistically great judge? You should judge the debate as it occurs in its entirety. You should not just come in with basic notes and then say, okay, let's just all compare our notes. And now we should also decide what we think about it. And then we can decide who do we think maybe is possibly in the top half of the debate, the first and the seconds. No, when you come in after the debate is done, you have already got an idea of how you feel about the debates, a general idea of your initial call, and all the notes and reasonings why you would probably be going towards that call. That's what you're then comparing during the deliberation period, okay? Secondly, there are no automatic firsts or fourths. There is no rule in any manual that has ever been set for debating that says if you don't do this, you should get a fourth. If you do this, you should get a first. I've seen some crazy examples in recent time where people have assumed rules have way more power than they should have. All right, these rules are to help you to evaluate which teams should be ranking first to fourth in terms of their value overall on the debates. But if it is a this House would motion and only one team has a policy, that is a really valuable positive contribution. But if they then stopped speaking after that and had nothing more to say, and all the other teams not explicitly having a policy, but had a general discussion, maybe partially policy discussion, but a lot of principle discussion, there is no that team just gets an automatic first. You need to fully evaluate the value of the debate, and that would be one of your value points that you would bring in, all right? Secondly, in terms of automatic fourths, I have seen judges say that teams did not give or take any points of information, therefore they got a fourth. No, that doesn't exist, all right? Yes, you can say, maybe this is the reason you didn't get a 79, you got a 78, because you didn't engage with at the level we expect, you didn't do any cross-engagement. Maybe you could say, like, you lost as closing opposition the clash to opening government, and I would like to just add that you had an opportunity to take a point of information to opening government to maybe reinstill this clash and give some analysis to it, but you didn't. That's what you can say as judges, something like that. However, you are not applying any automatic firsts or fourths. I cannot stress this enough. This seems to be the most controversial briefing consideration in recent times in debating. There should also be fair and even burdens applied to all teams. You can't say that because of how the real world looks like, or what you know about the world, or what you feel about the world, or just our general ideas of democracy, or whatever in total, that you would say that like opposition had to really, really prove to you X, Y, and Z. Largely, the speakers are already defining the burdens for you as adjudicators. You should be going with the burdens that the speakers have brought in that haven't been challenged, or if they have been successfully challenged, what burdens exist at the end of the debates and are the most reasonable and fair. All right. Pairwise comparisons. Teams should always be compared directly, opening government to opening opposition, opening government to closing government, opening government to closing opposition, etc. When comparing the top half, closing half should not matter. When comparing the closing half, you could say how they've interacted with the top half, but it's generally about the engagement between the two. When comparing a long diagonal, you don't consider also the short diagonal. You might, but you would also consider a short diagonal and not consider as much the long diagonal, etc., etc., etc. Through all of these pairwise comparisons, you should come up with the teams that are bringing in the most valuable contributions, who are engaging the most, and who are, winning the burdens that the debates has set up for itself. Okay, engagement between diagonals can be assessed by looking at direct rebuttal or preemption rebuttal, and explicit rebuttal or preemption of that rebuttal again. Okay, and also points of information. Okay, so another common mistake I feel like teams are making is just locking opening government out by basically saying that opening government didn't engage with the closing half. That's not helpful because of opening government's position in the debate. You're then the problem, not the format. You should be looking at how they were able to deal with clashes in a preemptive way. What did they contribute with points of information that maybe highlighted their contributions? Basically, did they generally remain relevant? Okay. Next slide. As an adjudicator, you should be acting as an average intelligent voter, right? That means that you should be non-interventionist. I think people are really struggling to understand like whether or not they're 100% being an average intelligent voter. I don't think you need to place so much sole pressure on yourself, but you just should be at all times trying to be an incredibly fair judge in the debate, okay? And honestly, like your speakers are doing really well. Just assess what they are saying. If there's anything absolutely crazy that's clearly not true, like basically saying that there are no queer people in the world is one that I've heard speakers say that an average intelligent voter can obviously say is not true. If or like a basic example, if they say the sky is not blue, right? Then you can say we didn't accept that claim. But generally, for all other debatable claims, you should be assessing what the speakers have brought in and also how they have been challenged by other speakers. Okay, so just act as, don't be a horrible person is essentially the rule there. Okay, so what is an average intelligent voter? You do not have any pre-formed views about any topic. Okay, you can't tell teams that you believed in democracy, so just because they were attacking democracy you put them in fourth. That doesn't work. It does not come from anywhere in that you, as an average intelligent voter, you do not come from anywhere in particular. So I'm South African. I can't say, oh, I bought into your analysis more because you placed it in South Africa and talked about the politics of South Africa. That would not be being an average intelligent voter. An average intelligent voter does not understand any technical vocabulary or examples which are not well explained, but can understand them if explained. All right. So, for example, if you're bringing in some big economic concepts that you would only get from studying economics. You're allowed to bring in those concepts, but it is the burden on speakers to then talk through what those actually mean. Because, I mean, even in academic study, people are still discussing the very parameters of all of these words that we generally speak about, okay, these buzzwords that we generally bring in. But it is not for me to assume what they mean and then apply that logic to their impacts in order to strengthen the government's or the team's case. If they haven't explained that for me, I can't use my knowledge to substantiate that I better understand their buzzwords that they brought in. That would be a lack of analysis from teams. I would then say that that is not yet a valuable contribution. Okay, you should have a general history of general knowledge of world history and current affairs. For example, you know that the 2008 financial crisis happened, but not hyper-specific details or knowledge about the cause and effects, okay? The way we used to write it in the manual is to say that the average intelligent voter is someone who has read all of the head or generally knows about the headlines that would be in the Wall Street Journal at this point in time and in previous times. However, I think that the way the wording of that has changed because the Wall Street Journal is no longer that reliable as a source of information. But generally, you just know about like what things are happening. You know there's a war somewhere. You know there's a conversation about the bear or the man. You know these things are happening, but you don't know all the specific details, okay? And second, last two, the average intelligent voter is capable of logically following and analyzing in debates and is familiar with the rules of British parliamentary. All right, some other quick notes. In terms of types of arguments, this is something you can go through but yourself. But the important thing here is that no one type of argument is automatically more persuasive than the other, and ordinary people can and often are persuaded by value-based or moral-based arguments, and that is okay as long as they have explained it thoroughly, given their like hypotheticals or their intuition pumps, you can be persuaded by moral logic, even if it perhaps is more difficult to do so. Okay, style. There should be no subjective forms of debate of style that are preferable to any judge. The way you assess style is simply did this style choice that the speaker made, it has to be a choice, impact my ability to understand their material or to see additional value in their material. So, for example, it's a choice for me to like stress the word choice like I just did. And you might say, oh, that helps me to understand that this is a clearly important burden. Wow, that's a good stylistic choice. But if I have a stutter, I have an accent, I have something that I'm not choosing to do as part of the style of my speech. You should not be assessing that. That is not part of the debate. If it is a difficulty for you to then understand the material, that should not be punished on the speaker. You, as the judge, should need to learn and do better and become better able to assess and work with multiple styles. Especially, we all want to go to Worlds here. This is a pre-Worlds tournament. They're going to be engaging with a lot of different styles of speaking, okay? Then equity considerations in judging. You do penalize equity violations to the extent that they make a speaker unpersuasive. Objectionable argumentation is likely to be persuasive to the average intelligent voter. For example, if they've made broad or excessive and offensive generalizations about a group of people that are intuitively wrong, they're intuitively then also not persuasive, okay? However, once again, there are no automatic penalties applied. You should probably just also refer to the equity officers if you need to raise an issue or make a complaint, but that shouldn't interfere then with your judging process. Okay, holistic judging, you should judge the debate as it has occurred in its entirety. We've talked about this all together as well. And this as well. Then deliberations. Chairs should also allow a short time for a panel to consider the decision notes, ask each member of the panel for their order before starting their own deliberation, guide the deliberation, facilitate a vote if necessary, and ensure a completed ballot within 15 minutes. Suggest calling the vote at perhaps 13 minutes so that you're within time. You still need to do speaker scores even at that point of voting. In terms of speaker scores, you should refer to the speaker scale, the world speaker scale. We'll send that out to all of the judges as well in the group chat, I think. All right. Use the whole range, highs and lows. There's no set range for this tournament, but use the scale qualitatively. Okay. Read it if you must. Do not compare the speaks to give you do not compare the speaks you give to the speaks you have gotten, okay? Speaks you assign to other speeches or speakers seen at other tournament tabs. So very clearly, just because a speaker maybe historically has been getting a 78, that doesn't mean that this wasn't a 75 speech. They could be given a 75. Just because you as a speaker have never gotten an 83 and now you're judging, doesn't mean that a speaker in front of you can never get an 83. You need to be properly assessing it, or else that is clearly a form of bias that you are using to assess the speaker scores, okay? In terms of oral adjudication, please, guys, lengthy, in-depth oral adjudications. We want speakers to feel like they have actually been analyzed in this debate. So there should be multiple reasons, multiple considerations, multiple pairwise considerations. Okay. You are providing some general feedback for, if any, for the debates. You are then giving the results at the front. So who placed first, second, third, and fourth, and also identifying if there were splits, if any. And then you can go into providing the reasoning and justification for all 6 comparisons in the round. Individual feedback should be given post-round if time permits. All right. At this point, I did say I can only stay until this point because I have another meeting to get to. So if there are any questions, I'll just kindly ask the OC to send that through to CAP, and then we can answer them live in our group